All right. Well, last time we did some armature. We started rigging actually, so we already parented the Totoro to the armature with the weight groups. But there were some slight issues. Being if we go to pose mode on the top left, we can now move the bones, of course. You can see that a lot of the mesh moves with, for example, the arm that shouldn't move. For example, a huge part around the shoulder there, even like the eye socket and stuff, it's moving with the arm. That's not the stuff that we really want to have happen. Same thing I think happens when we move this pelvis down. You can see that a lot of the stuff actually moves with it. That is not really, well, it's not what we want really. All right, so I'm first going to select this head real quick. There's somebody popping in and out. What's happening? All right, so I'm gonna select this head, and I think I'm just gonna disable this IK for a second. Just because, well, I think it's in the way a little bit. Because if I enable this and I move my pelvis down, you can see that it moves quite oddly. But if I disable this for a second and then just move my hips down, it acts like an actual like character that's bending down and sitting up. So we will re-enable that whenever we want, but for now, it looks good without. So that's one thing that you can just do. You can select your IK chain, for example. You can just disable it and enable it by clicking on this little I button on the right to it. Makes it a lot easier. All right, so weight painting, what is it? How can you use it? Well, weight painting is something you will use for a lot of stuff in Blender. You can use it to control where particle systems are going to be, so where on your mesh you want hair to appear, for example. We will be using that for the hairs here as well, perhaps. You can use it to displace water. You can use it to control the armature of your mesh, right? So if I select my Totoro, and last time we parented the Totoro to the armature with automatic weights. Remember? If you didn't do that yet, you can select your Totoro, hold Shift, select the armature, Control P, and then armature deform with automatic weights. All right, so if you then select your Totoro and go to your vertex, the object data properties, it's the vertex tab right there. You can see that we have a whole bunch of new vertex groups, and you can scroll up and down in that list. And you can see that for every bone that we added on the Totoro, there is a new vertex group, which contains the information for the weight paint. Alright, so if we go from object mode to weight paint, you can see that, for example, we have now got the toes on the right side selected. You can see that the mesh that is parented to that bone is painted. Alright, and a red color means that it's a weight of 1, and a blue color means a weight of 0. Everything that's weight 0 is not parented to that bone. Everything that's red is fully parented, and anything in between, so orange, yellow, green, light blue, that's going to be like a less amount of parented, right? So green will be about 50%, which means that if I move this bone to the right, then this green part will only move, for example, 50% of the distance, right? So then you get a very smooth transition from bone to bone. Now, for example, if I select my pelvis, you can see what parts of the mesh are parented to that pelvis bone. And we can see that only this back part is parented, for example, right? Only the ass. But we also want this front part to be parented to that bone, for example, the belly that's extending quite a lot. So right now, there is a very easy way to fix this. And we can go to object mode. We can select our armature, hold shift, select our Totoro, and then go to weight paint. And now we can just hold control and click on a bone to see which weights are assigned to that bone, right? Which means we can now very easily just go from bone to bone and see what is parented to that specific bone, right? So we can see that, for example, if I select this hip bone, this upper leg bone right there, there's a lot of the stomach actually parented to that bone, which is something we definitely don't want happening. Same thing for example, the shoulder right there. We can see that the light blue color goes all the way up to like the eye socket, while we wanted to stop right there at the shoulder range, right? So we're gonna be fixing this. And the way to do this is by simply setting the weight from 1. If the weight is 1, we can be painting some strong weights, so you get that red color. But if we set this to 0, we're gonna be getting that blue color. So I can actually remove weights, as you can see. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that we have a mirror modifier enabled on Totoro, right? So the left part is mirrored from the right, which means that if I now select my left bone setup, which is the mirrored side, and if I now just start trying to draw weights, nothing is happening. The reason being is that this is mirrored, which means we can't paint weights there. But what it does also mean is that we paint our weights in the right side, so the original side, the same effects are going to be mirrored on the left side as well. So we only have to weight paint one side of the mesh, which just saves us a little bit of work. All right, so I'm actually going to set this on 0, and I'm just going to start removing parts of the shoulder. So make it blue, parts that I don't want to be transformed with that shoulder bone. All right, so we can just remove that, and don't worry about it being a little bit jagged right now. We can fix that in a second. All right, so a good thing to remember now is that even a very slight blue color, for example, right here, it is dark blue, but not quite as dark as the rest. It means it's still gonna be deforming your mesh. So everything needs to be completely blue that you don't want to be parented to that bone. Okay, so let's just draw that in, make it nice and dark blue. The back of the neck there as well, dark blue. Move that all the way to the right. And you can see that it's going a little bit buggy, and it's because we don't have that much geometry. Right, if I go to edit mode instead, you can see that the weight paint will only be applied where your vertexes are. All right, and we don't have a lot of vertexes, which means that it's gonna be snapping a little bit, right? It's gonna be snapping more to those vertexes. If you want to be more precise with this, you can apply a modifier, a subdivision modifier first, but I don't think it's needed just yet. All right, so this is already looking much better, much better. We still have to remove parts of this mouth there. And important is that we also take account the inner parts of this mouth. You can see that it's nice and blue. We want that to be gone. Just like that. Just like that. Just paint that inner part. And if you're not sure if everything is actually deleted there, you can go to the front view and you can go to edit mode. And you can just hit select on that bone group, on that vertex group, right? There's a select button on the bottom right, and that will select all of that group. You can see, and that is actually way too much, which means that there's actually a lot of geometry still parented to that upper arm group. All right, so let's see if we can fix that a little bit more. And just by drawing more blue in everywhere. Remember what I said, even the slightest hint of light blue will actually start affecting your mesh, which is something we don't want. All right, so let's just test this out now. If I go to object mode, select my armature and go to pose mode, and if I now move my arm, you can see that's already much, much better, right? The face is not moving anymore. The actual body is not moving anymore when I move the arm. And that's perfect. And the same thing goes for the left side of the arm. Right, it's actually moving like you would expect an arm to move, how you expect a shoulder to pretty much move. Of course, it's not perfect human anatomy, but we're making an anime character, so what the hell. All right, so the next thing we can take a look at is this pelvis bone, right? That's not looking great. If I go to side view and move this up and down, the stomach is going in and out for some reason, which is not something that should happen with this movement. All right, so what I'm going to do is once again, go to object mode. I'm going to select my armature, hold shift, select the tutorial, object mode, switch that to weight paint. All right, and I'm going to select control click on this pelvis bone, and I'm actually going to be adding some weights all around this hip area, right? All around the waist. So set your weight to 1, and let's just draw there. Let's just draw all around our character's belt area, like that. Doesn't have to be perfect. Doesn't have to be perfect at all. Just like that. And I actually want this area as well, right? Between the legs. Just like that. That's gonna look way better. All right, so it's quite harsh now. That's a problem. How do we fix that? How do we fix something that is harsh? Well, there are 2 brushes for this in the weight paint mode. We've got a blur. If I select that and draw, for example, on this top part, you can see that's going to be blurring out a little bit, going to transition a bit smoother everywhere. It's a little bit too strong in my opinion. I'm going to use the average brush for a lot of stuff as well. which means that it's gonna be taking the average of the weights that are in this area. For example, if I'm gonna draw right here, it's gonna turn this color into something that is more in between of the blue and the red. So that there's red and blue in the circle. You can see the circle, the red circle. And it's gonna turn it into like an average color. Now we can also decrease that strength a little bit to 0.3 for example, and it's gonna be much softer to work with. Right, so that's much better already. So I'm gonna just draw around this a little bit, make it a bit softer. Do the same for the legs right there. Make this nice and soft. Actually, we don't want that much legs to be added. Something like this is already looking better. Alright, and if we think there's too much legs included, we can just go to the brush, set the weight to 0, and just paint some of that stuff away. Alright, like I just showed you, you can just remove and add weights wherever you want. And then to smoothen it out, you can set that average brush and just draw some parts back in with that average brush. Just like that. Adding some colors back. Make it nice and smooth on the bottom side. Nice and smooth on the top. And that's already much better, right? So if I now control click on this right pelvis bone, remember we have it mirrored, so we can't control the right, or sorry, the left part of the Totoro. We have to control the right. There's still a lot of this belly area that is taken into account with the upper leg bone. Alright, so we're gonna select the draw brush, weight to 0, and I'm just gonna remove all of that stuff on the top there that shouldn't be controlled at all. Alright, so draw that away. Keep on drawing until all that color is nice and gone. Like this. Looking perfect. I don't want a lot in the center. Remember, we already have this part assigned to the pelvis bone, so we don't need to assign that to the leg bone as well. Something like that looks great. All right, let's select the blur tool now and set the strength a little bit lower. Let's just try to blur this out a little bit, right? And blurring is such a huge deal in bones. Blurring or average brush, both of them will work. Because otherwise you're getting a very hard transition and part of your mesh are just gonna like bend in 90-degree angles while you want it to be more smooth. Alright, so let's see how this looks. If I go to object mode, select my armature, go to pose mode, we can now see that if I move this down, it moves much more natural. The belly moves with it. I can move the legs up and it will just look much more natural. And you can see that even though we deleted some of that wrong weight, you can still see that the part of the neck there still moves with this bone. Alright, so let's just fix that real quick. I'm going to hit A, pose, clear transform all, just to get back to that original position. Let's go to object mode, select our Totoro, hold shift, select the, hit the armature first, hold shift, then the Totoro. Go to weight paint, and let's just remove some parts of that neck area. For some reason there is something that moves with the legs, so I'm just gonna draw that in. I think this was the issue right there. And just remove that. Alright, just go over it a few times and it will fix it. Alright, and part of this I want to go on as well. Right there. And I'm gonna pick the average brush. Just make this a little smooth again. Like that. Alright, so I think that will do. You can tweak this as much as you want. I don't want to get caught up on this. So if we now move that leg, you can see that it's already looking much better, right? So the neck is not moving anymore. I think a small part of the chin is still moving, but I'm not gonna fix that. I'll leave that up to you if you have that issue. You know how to do it now. Alright, so that's looking perfect. And we can just rotate our spine, rotate that inwards, make him bend down. It's looking perfect, actually. Alright, nice. So that is pretty much how you can fit your mesh to your armature. Alright, so each mesh that you make, whether it's going to be a Totoro, a Kitaro, a baked potato, a puppet, any mesh needs a different kind of weight painting. Alright, so it all depends on the shape. Now, what is the next step? I'm just going to hide this armature for a little bit. And what I'm going to do next is just focus on some hairs. Right, I think we've done some annoying parts, some weight painting, some armature setting up. I think it's time for some fun parts. So actually adding hairs is, well, I like it a lot. I like hairs in Blender. It's something I do for a lot of my models just because I think it looks nice, looks fluffy. I like fluffy things, and well, makes you feel like a barber, pretty much. So if you want hair to be added, we can just hit that plus sign and set that to hair. Beautiful. Now it's only gonna appear on one side of the mesh. Reason being is that we got a whole stack of modifiers lined up right there. Right, and the particle system is at the end, which makes you think that it should work. However, there's an option in the particle settings right beneath the source that says use modifier stack. By default, that is disabled. So if you want this to take into account the mirror modifier, for example, we're gonna have to enable this check mark right there, and then you will have hair all over the place. Beautiful. All right, we can set the hairs to be less long, so decrease that length. By default, it will always be on 4 meters, which is usually always too long as well. All right, so we can just decrease that. And now you can see that there are hairs appearing on some parts of the mesh that we don't want. For example, that mouth hole, the eye sockets, those are all parts that should not have hairs. All right, so this is where we're gonna be working with weight painting once again. Right, remember what I said, weights can be used for a lot of things, and also to define where hairs are gonna be and where they aren't gonna be. All right, so what we can do is go to the object data property tab where we have all of these weight tabs, and we can just hit that plus sign. All right, it's gonna add a new one, and we can call this hairs. All right, and then we can go to weight paint, and we can just draw in all the parts that we don't want to have included in the hairs. All right, so first things first, I'm gonna go to object mode. I'm gonna hide my eyeballs and my iris, just so we see, oh, that's the wrong one, the iris. There we go, hide that, and that just means that we have a little bit more area to work with. All right, so I'm gonna go to Totoro, weight paint, brush, set the weight to 1, and let's just paint in those eye sockets. All right, I don't want hairs to appear there, not at all, and maybe even go a little bit outside the eye. All right, because we can just get a nice eyelid going like that. Add some nice materials for the eyelids as well. Something like this is looking perfect. Make that all red, not orange. We want it to be fully red. No hairs at all. All right, so that is the eye socket. Now we want that entire mouth area, which is gonna take us a little bit of effort because it is quite an irritating shape to work with. But I'm just gonna start drawing and we'll be all right. Good thing we have that mirror modifier enabled. Works very nicely like this. Just start drawing stuff in. If this doesn't work for you, right? If you think this is annoying as fuck, and it is, we can just go to edit mode instead, and we can go to X-ray mode, and we can just try to select all the vertices that we don't want to be included in this hairs, or that we do want to include in the weight paint, but that we don't want hairs on. All right, so there's a different way to assign weights to your weight group other than just weight painting. All right, you can also select vertexes or faces and just hit assign on that group. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to face select, so press 3, and I'm just gonna double click on those edge loop that I want to be excluded from hairs. So these, don't forget to select that bottom one as well. And this one, no hairs there, please. Deselect this real quick. This one, that's the wrong one. Make sure you select all the right ones. We are still in mirror mode, so this is only going to be half, but that's fine. Hold shift, select that one, I don't want hairs there. And for good fun, let's also exclude hairs on this one. All right, make sure all of them are selected. And now we can just hit the assign button. All right, assign, and then just click out of your mesh. And now if you hit the select button, you can see what is added to that hair group, right? So we can see the eyes that we actually weight painted, and we can just manually select some of the faces that aren't included yet. For example, these, we can just hit assign there. And what I'm gonna do, there's one edge in the back for some reason that got selected as well. What I'm gonna do is just select that edge alone and hit remove, and that should do, right? So now we have our mesh with a weight paint group of hairs. That pretty much is all the areas that we don't want hairs to be. So go to the hair group, so the particle properties, scroll all the way down to vertex groups, and we can set this density to hairs, right? The weight paint we just created. And all we have to do now is set this to the inverse, all right? So we can just hit that inverse group right there, and it excludes hairs from the mouth and from the eye sockets. Now, one thing that I did notice is that if we invert this once again, there's too much selected around the eye sockets. So what I'm going to do is go to the object data properties, and I'm going to go into edit mode, and I'm going to hit select on those hairs. All right, so I think that if we exclude this outer ring of hairs, or sorry, of faces, we'll have a better result. So what I'm going to do is click out of my mesh and select those outer rings. This one right there, and just hit remove. There we go. And this is looking much better now. All right, so now the hairs will be excluded from the eye sockets and the mouth. So let's go to the particle settings, and let's invert this real quick. There we go, that's looking much better. We still have one hair in the eye for some reason, but we can change that very easily once we're gonna be starting grooming. All right, so for the hairs themselves, how do we get started on that? Well, this is where the fun begins. This is where the magic happens, right? So how do we get from this to an actual fluffy model of Totoro? All right, we just have some gray strands that we want to turn into actual hairs. First things first, we have this source tab, and the distribution is by default set on jittered, which means it's gonna be pretty much distributing our hairs in a jittered motion. And even though the random order is selected and the even distribution as well, it's not gonna be totally random at all, right? They're just pretty much lying in your face about that. So we're gonna set the distribution from jittered to random instead. So now it's random. All right, so I'm not sure what jittered is used for pretty much, but I just always set this to random, and it is much more random than the jittered one. All right, so that is the first step. Next step, we need way more hairs. You can see we got bald spots all over the place. We got bald spots on the ears, we got bald spots on the forehead. We can add children of those hairs later, but by default you want a great starting foundation to add that to, which means we need a high number of hairs. So I'm going to set this to, well, let's try 2500 first. You can see some of these spots are already filling in the ears as well. Let's do even more. Let's set this to 4000. All right, and you can imagine that the more hairs you add, the harder it's going to be for your system to deal with this as well, right? So you got to keep this a little bit controlled. I know what my system is capable of, so I'm not too concerned yet. If your system is, to the lower specs, then just change this number to be lower, or try to make it higher with some lags. You can also decrease this number and try to add children particles, which is something we're going to do now. So if I set this to interpolated, which means it's going to be adding new hairs in between the hairs that we already have. All right, children means we're going to be adding, well, pretty much the children of those hairs, right? So if you set this to interpolated, you can see new particles are added everywhere in the mesh, and these eye sockets are still not looking great. So we'll have to take a look at that later. So you can see that we have a display amount for those particles and a render amount, right? So the default is 10 and 100, which means that what we're seeing now is like adding 10 hairs to each single hair, which means that we're pretty much going to have 4000 multiplied by 10 is 40,000 hairs, right? In the render, we're going to have 400,000 hairs because we have this set to 100 in the render, which means that if you once add a hair system to your mesh and it works fine in the viewport and then you hit render and your Blender crashes, it means that you probably have a difference in your render amount and display amount. And if it's trying to add 10 times more hairs in your render, then that can cause issues, as you may think. Well, I usually set this to the same amount at first because I like seeing exactly what I'm going to end up with, right? And hairs are not a big deal until you actually start going into the rendered view, right? Right now we're on solid view, which means Blender can handle itself pretty well. So I can set this to 50 and it will work. I can set this to 100. it will still work fine, very smooth still. And you can see that we are gonna add some very, very fluffy stuff on our Totoro mesh. Right, so the mouth is actually looking great. The hairs are added on the right locations. For the eyes though, not so much. Alright, so we have to change that somehow. The reason this is not working properly is because we have a subdivision modifier going. Alright, and that is just messing with our stuff a little bit. So we either have to add an edge loop on the outside there, or an edge loop on the inside, and then we will have a much better result. Alright, so what I'm gonna do is add an edge loop in this inside area. So I'm gonna hit 2, I'm gonna hit Ctrl R, and I'm gonna left click there and just move that all the way to that top edge. And it's gonna be sharper, but that's fine. We can change that later if need is there. So right now we added an edge loop. If I go to X-ray mode, you can see it. We have two edges close to each other. And if I go back to object mode now and enable my particle system, you can see that there are already less particles on the inside. And the particles that are in the inside, they are pretty much moving from this edge right there to the inside of my eye socket. So we can fix that with grooming the hairs. Alright, so I'm gonna set this back to about 30. I have an idea of how many we need in the end. 30 is not enough, but we can work with that for the grooming part. Alright, so if I now want to shape this hair, right now it's sticking out. It's completely like in the normal direction of the mesh, and the normal direction is like the direction that is, well, it's pretty much perpendicular on this face. Right, so a 90-degree angle out is gonna be the normal direction pretty much, and I can enable this somewhere. I forgot where that place is to enable that. It should be here. Face normals, there we go. So if I enable that, you can see that everything that is like perpendicular on that face is gonna be the normal, and that's also gonna be the direction of our hairs. Right, that's also where these hairs there are gonna be moving inwards, because the normals are facing inwards as well. Right, so that is how you can see your normals. And let me disable that right away. There we go. And now we can go from object mode to particle edit. Right, and now we see the hairs that we can groom. And you have a few different, well, pretty much brushes in the particle edit. You've got the comb brush, and that's doing exactly what you think. You can just comb your hair like you will do in real life as well, right? You can make this move to the left, you can make this move to the right, you can make like a nice cut in the hair like that. You can do pretty much whatever you want with it. Like, you can go crazy on this, and this is where I spend most of my times when I'm working with hairs, when I work with like animal fur, human hairs, anything. This is where you define the actual pattern of the hairs and the direction of those hairs. Alright, so something I start off with pretty much all the time is press Alt Z. That will make you go into the X-ray mode. And usually I do that with a button, but for some reason I remembered the shortcut for that, which is the first time pretty much. And we can now affect both the front and the back hairs of Totoro at the same time. Which means that if I now draw everything down, the entire hairs from Totoro will be facing down as well. And that is perfect. I usually start off with this to basically define the general direction of the hairs. On, for example, the arm, on the legs, I want this to be moving inwards a little bit, like that. For the stomach as well, I want this to be in a rounded shape, pretty much. I'm gonna move this out. I'm gonna move this out. And the face, I've got an idea for the face. Oh, actually, we have to match Totoro. I was going a little bit rogue there. We have to follow the reference, of course. We have to remember that. But I really want to add like a little bit of a fluffy hair system on the top there. So I'm just going to move that out a little bit. We can add our own input, right? We don't have to follow it entirely. I mean, if you want it to be perfectly matched with the reference, please feel free to do it. I'm just going to add some wild hairs on the top there. For the ears, I'm going to move this up actually. So move everything up there. And let's also just move this out a little bit. So if you see me changing like the size of this the circle, which is like the size of the comb brush as well, I'm pressing F. Alright? F will make you swipe it down or up. So depending on the size you want, you can swipe that up and down. Alright, so I'm just going to move this to the sides a little bit. And for hairs, the general rule that there is that you don't want the hairs to be completely flat on your mesh, because that's going to leave you with some very weird shading. All right, in general, you want this to be like a little bit outside of your mesh, a little bit of an offset. That's what hair generally does, right? It moves out a little bit, and that is just what we want as well. All right, next up, to do this on a large scale, right? We're not going to be moving every single hair out by hand like this. We want to do this, well, in an easier way. And there's a brush for that, and it's called Puff. Right? Puff basically adds volume to your hair. Compared to like drying it, you can add very, very easily add volume. All right, so we're gonna select that puff brush, and if I move this up the size with F, I can just start drawing there, and it will move all of those hairs out slightly. All right, just like that. Same thing for the left arm. Just like that. Move it out a little bit. Same thing for the head. Everything needs to be out a little bit to make it look nice. Same thing for the legs. Make it move away from the mesh a little bit. Same thing for the stomach as well. Remember to go into side view every once in a while as well, because now you can see this part is completely flat on the chest. We want to move that out a little bit. Like that. Beautiful. Same thing for the head right there. The neck. I'm going to go to my brush, my comb brush, and just move those ears to a better position. Just like that. My hair's there. I want this to be going back a little bit. So you can see that I'm just doing, I'm just moving hairs into the directions that I actually want them to be in. And you can check reference images of animals, of fur, and it will all give you a better indication of what you have to do. Just like this. I usually try to follow the organic shapes of the body a little bit. Right? So if the curve of the belly goes out, I make those hairs follow the curve of that belly as well. Just like that. Now for those feet, I want this to be a little bit shorter, right? Those hairs are too long. I don't want them to stick out as much. So we can fix that on two ways. We've got a length brush, right? I can select that, and I can set this to grow or to shrink. Grow means, well, I just grow the hair out, right? It just grows the hair like a magic serum. If I set this to shrink, it will just shorten all of those hairs, which is something we need pretty much. Just like that, we can shorten the hairs on the bottom of the feet, because we don't want the hairs to be that long there. Beautiful. Now we can do the same thing, for example, for the hands. Make it a little bit shorter there. Make this a little bit shorter. And for the eye sockets, I have a different plan in mind. So I'm going to disable X-ray. And to take care of those hairs that are inside of my eye sockets, I am first going to try to comb them out. Just like that. And if that doesn't work, I'm just going to select the cut brush. Alright? Just a scissor one. And I'm just going to cut off these hairs. They're in my way. Be gone. It's as easy as that. Beautiful. This one as well. They're getting too close for comfort. These two, get rid of them. Just like that. Now, if you think there's like a blind spot, for example, right there, you can add new hairs as well. Right? There's an add brush. It's the green one with the plus sign. And there are a few options on the top. You've got the radius, which is the size of your brush pretty much. And you've got the count. So how many particles are going to be added, how many hairs, how many steps and keys. I don't usually work with that. And we have interpolate as well, which is going to add new particles depending on the hairs that are there already. And basically means that if I select this, add a hair, it's going to try to follow the shape of the hairs that are already there. Right, so I can zoom out a little bit and I can set the count to 5, for example. Just add 5 new hairs right there, right there, right there. Everywhere there are some empty spots, I'm going to add new hairs. And it doesn't really matter the like the children particles of interpolated usually take care of those spots. But the beauty is, for example, if we have an animal with short fur on the head, for example, a cat. Right, a cat has very short hairs around the nose. A dog has that as well. In general, they have, for example, a golden retriever has nice long hairs. But around the nose and the eyes and the head, the hairs are much shorter. Alright? The only way to make that fur closed, so you don't see the skin underneath, is to add more hairs. But you don't want to add more hairs where it's not needed. Right? So you don't want to add more hairs where it's already long. So this is where you can just add hairs manually where you need more. For example, on that face area, if you need more there, you can just add more hairs very easily, like this. All right, so keep that in mind. Now, I do want to remove some from that nose area, I guess. So I'm going to go to the cut, and I'm just cutting this away, right? I still want the nose to be pretty much visible, and that will do. That will do for now. So if I go back to object mode, we can see instantly that we have more hairs appearing again, right? So instantly we get those children particles back. And we can see that the shape of those hairs are much better. They're still going over the nose, but we can fix that by going into particle edit, going into the comb brush, and just move this out, right? Follow the shape of the nose more, like this. And do it for the sides there as well. Make it follow the shape of the face. That's what hairs usually do, right? That's what mustache. Mustache? Am I saying that right? I don't know. That's what this does. So I can move this to the side, for example, as well, to follow the shape of the mouth a little bit so it doesn't overlap. Just like that. Make a nice looking mustache. Just like that. Move this out a little bit. Just like that. Remember, I don't want hairs to be flat on my face. There we go. So now we have a Totoro with a mustache, right? Go to object mode. You can see it splits nicely there. It's not moving over the mouth anymore. You can keep tweaking this up to where you like it. It's not that big of a deal. I'm not going to spend too much time here. I could sculpt and groom a model for hours and hours. Right, so now the mesh is quite finished, right? We have quite some nice hairs, but they are looking a little bit static, right? That's the last thing I will show you. It's looking a little bit too perfect. It's all looking too straight. So we can now change that, right? And the only way we can change that if we have children. If I set this to none and watch these options at the bottom there, if I go to none, all those options disappear, right? I can set this to simple or to interpolated, and it will just add these options back. And this is what you generally use to create randomness in your hairs, in your fur. This is how you add curls, stuff like that. So you usually need some children to access these particles. All right, so even if you don't want any, you need them. So if you don't want them, you can set this to the lowest amount, which is 1. And then you can still access those parting, clumping, roughness things. I just want to have more, 30. All right, first things first, I will go through these real quick. We have parting, which will basically split up your hairs a little bit more, right? You can see it in like the ears and stuff. It's going to split them up more. It's going to part the hairs away from each other a bit more. Something you can see even more when you are going to add clumping and roughness. All right, so I'll start with clumping. Clumping is a beautiful thing. All right, remember, or for example, imagine you're adding like gel or wax to your hairs. You'll have these strands that are going to be sticking together, so you get like these pointy spikes a little bit, right? So that is pretty much what clumping is. If I swipe this to the right, you can see we get more of these pointy, spiky curves and hairs that you usually see in like fur as well for animals outside, because it gets dirty, it gets sticky, it gets greasy, and those hairs are going to be sticking together a bit more. So that's usually something you use for like animals and fur like this. All right, so this may be a little bit much. I'm going to crank this down a little bit. And now you have got a shape as well, which means from which point it's going to be clumping. All right, if I set this to 0, it's going to be clumping from the start all the way to the end. But if I set this shape to 1, it's only going to be clumping the final parts of those hairs, right? If I set this all the way to 1, it's only going to be pretty much moving those outer points of the hairs to the inside. All right, so if I set this to -1, it's only going to be clumping the start, which is something you pretty much never use. I usually set this to about 0.75, something like that. That looks perfect, right? It may be a little bit much, so I'm going to decrease that a little bit. So we still have some nice depth. All right, next up real quick, we have clump noise, which you could use to add some variation. I usually don't do that at all, so I'd leave that off. We have roughness next, which is beautiful. Roughness adds a lot of variation in the hairs, right? It's still static, still very perfect. But if I crank up this uniform value, and you have to hold shift because it changes very quickly, and crank this up, you can see that we're going to be adding randomness to our fur more. All right, but it's gonna be in very large steps. So if we set this to, for example, 0.08, we can now change the size to be lower. So if I lower this, you can see more and more it's gonna affect the hairs on a smaller scale. See it happening in front of your eyes. There we go. So you can set this to whatever you want. I'm gonna leave this at around 0.6. Yeah, that's fine. I'm gonna set this a little bit lower, 0.05. Now we have the endpoint and the shape. We have the endpoint that we can crank up to, well, pretty much move those endpoints out a little bit more. If you want a bit more randomness there, you can make that happen. It is nice to have it a little bit. So I'm going to set this to like 0.2. And we can change the shape as well to be more and less. All right, so just play around with that. Now we have the random section as well. So I can pretty much crank the random value up, and it's going to be moving all of these hairs in random directions. Right, so hold shift, and we can just decrease the size like I just showed you as well. Right, so then we can, for example, create some very, very rough looking hair that's moving all over the place. It may be a little bit much, so I'm going to set the size to over 0.7 for now. And so let's just work with that. Now we've got a kink as well. And it's not the kink you think, it's just a kink that is pretty much going to be twisting or curling your hairs. Right, so you have a lot of different settings. I'm just going to show you the curl for now. The curl starts with a huge amplitude of 0.2, which is always and always too big. So I usually set this to much lower values. I'm going to crank this down, and the amplitude, you may notice if you had like math or chemistry, anything like that, it is like the amount it moves away from the direction that it's moving in, right? Something like this. So it's moving quite a lot. And we have the frequency, which basically means how many curls there will be for the length of the hair, right? So if I move the frequency up to 5, it's going to be curling more. Now we can't see this because we've got a lot of short hairs going on. And another reason is because we don't have a lot of resolution yet, right? There is a viewport display setting and a render setting. And the steps define how much resolution you have, right? If you only have 2 steps in the viewport, it is going to look very blocky, right? We only have 1, 2, 3 points there, pretty much. So if I move this to 5, we can get a lot more detail, and you can already see these curls pretty much up here. All right. Remember to also set this up for your render then, otherwise it's going to look bad in the render. And this is pretty much how you affect your hairs, right? So now you can go back to your curling all the way there, and you can start tweaking those values with more precision, right? This is way too much, for example, and 0.01, for example, like that. You don't want a lot of curl for this one. I think Totoro has nice and straight hairs. And the other values that you want to tweak down a little bit now may be the uniform value and the random value as well, just like that. All right, so that's already looking quite nice. If I go to rendered view, we are only going to be seeing some white hairs, but you can see that we're going to start adding some nice furs, and it's looking way too thick, but that's for the next tutorial. We're going to be tweaking that into something that actually looks fluffy and beautiful. But it's a very nice starting foundation on how to start working on that sculpting of the hairs. It's a lot of fun, so go nuts with that. All right, that's going to be it for this tutorial. We've been going at this for over 30 minutes, I think. Yeah, we've been going for some time now. And thank you all for watching. I hope you have as much fun with hairs as I do. And if there are any questions, feel free to ask them.
Impressive lesson for sure.
Oh, I think my
Was
headphones
really
are off.
interesting.
Give me a sec. What did you say, Mr. Big?
Interesting lesson, like really interesting. To see or for what you need to look actually when you have like the weight painting, for what you want to look and for what you didn't want to look. Was an interesting lesson. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it is weight painting. You will use that way more in the future. It's not only going to be hair. It's not only going to be armatures. You're going to be using it for a huge variation of stuff. So the sooner you pretty much dive into that, the better it's going to be. Are there any questions? Otherwise, I'm going to wrap this up and have some dinner.
Sounds fine for me.
Bulvair in the chat, I think. Is there an IRL solution for weight painting? I need to grow some. It's called a hair transplant. I think you can get them quite cheap in Turkey, perhaps. Oh yeah, that's actually cool. You get these like very tiny dots on your head, and then gonna be like look like hair. All right. Well, that is it then. I'll see you guys in the next one. And tomorrow, I think there is another coffee shop, another fun
Yes,
time.
sir.
So be sure to check out our Discord events to see at what time it's gonna be, and we would love to see you there. See you guys in the next one. Have a nice evening.
See ya. Bye bye. Have a nice evening.